Hello and welcome to Bites Bread and Barbecue. Today we're going to be talking about my buddy Tux here and what he represents. Tux is the penguin that represents Linux distributions. Linux is an operating system that several of my friends have asked me why I use it and what is it. There seems to be some curiosity. A lot of people don't know anything about Linux, so I thought I would explain a little bit about what it is and why it's my favorite environment to actually run on my computers. So if you find this helpful, make sure that you click the subscribe button down below. It really helps us out on YouTube. So let's get to it. Let's talk about Linux. So exactly what is Linux? And from Wikipedia, we can see that Linux is a family of open source Unix-like operating systems based on the Linux kernel, an operating system that was first released in 1991 by Linus Torvalds, and Linux is typically packaged as a Linux distribution. So this is a bunch of gobbledygook. But what Linux is, it's an operating system just like Windows or Mac. It is a system that is an interface for you to use on your computer. And the interesting thing is that in the United States, not many people use Linux, or they think they don't use it. And they tend to buy Windows-based computers or Mac-based computers. But globally, Linux is by far the most popular operating system out there. Most of the internet, it's something close to 90% of the internet runs on Linux. So even when you think you're running your Windows computer, if you're on the internet, you're working probably off of a Linux server. There are Windows servers out there, so somebody's going to tell me that I'm not correct, but the vast majority of them are Linux. The other thing is, internationally, colleges in other countries are teaching Linux because it is an open source and free operating system. This makes it cheaper for them to have on their computers when they're teaching their computer programming students. Interestingly, NASA uses Linux in the United States, and our outer space gear runs Linux. And of course, the big joke is, why does NASA use Linux? It's because you can't open Windows in space. That's not really the reason, folks. So anyway, this is Linux, and Tux is the emblem that represents all flavors of Linux. He's a little penguin, and whenever you see him, he says that I am all about Linux. So why should I use Linux? Well, first of all, Linux is very, very secure. It doesn't get viruses as a rule, although there is one or two antivirus programs out there, and I'm sure if somebody would specifically go out and try to target Linux for a few moments, that they could probably do it. But the thing of it is that the community is so supportive that the problem would be fixed within minutes. So it is very, very secure. The other reason it's secure is that only the root user, or if you want to think of an administrator, is the one that can change the system. The average user cannot really change anything except their own personal files. It's very, very stable. Linux does not crash. Now, I'm going to say that, and somebody says, well, I crash it. Yeah, there are situations where you can't say anything is 100%. But as a rule, Linux is incredibly stable and does not crash. You don't get the blue screen of death that you frequently see with Windows. It's very easy to maintain. The community at large posts different patches, and your Linux computer will ask you if you're ready to update, but it does put out any type of security patches or upgrades directly to your computer. There's very little maintenance that has to be done on the end of the user. It runs on almost any hardware. You can run this on Athlon chips, on Intel chips. You can run this on small devices. If you use an Android phone, Android is a form of Linux. You will see that Linux will sometimes show up on household devices that have a software interface in a very lightweight form. If you have a Chromebook is actually a type of Linux. So it does work very well across all sorts of different hardware. I recently rehabilitated a 2009 Athlon 2 dual-core processor computer to make it run as fast as any i7 or i9 out there on the market today using a lightweight form of Linux. This is very possible. The other thing is Linux is free. As we already talked about, a lot of international programs are using it. The reason that they do this is it is free. Nobody charges for it. You don't have to spend $300 for a copy of Windows or Mac OS. It is also open source. What does that mean? That means that you can look at the source code for Linux if you wanted. And if I wanted to form a version of Ross's Linux, I could very well take the source code and form my own version. Although that's not really advisable. There are some major distributions out there that you should be using. But the thing of it is, nothing is secret. Anybody in the world can open up the code and look at it. It's very easy to use. Most Linux operating systems come with a graphic user interface, very similar to what you're used to using on Apple or Mac. Apple or Windows. So it's very easy to use. And lastly, it's very customizable. You can use a lot of different shells to make it look completely different or to make it fit your work process. Education, as I said, it's being used a lot in educational institutions across the globe. And a lot of schools in the US are now giving Chromebooks to their students to use. And essentially, Chrome is a variant of Linux. Support is given through a community of users. There are certain distributions do have sort of a corporate presence behind them, but the support is basically made up of the collective of everybody who uses Linux. And this gives you a very fast, rapid network that you will always have access to. Reasons not to use Linux. And if you have qualms with some of these may be reasons for you not to try it. You can't go to a store like Staples or Best Buy and buy any software to run on Linux. It doesn't work that way. Linux essentially has an app store much like your phone does, except all the software that runs on Linux is open source and free. If you need to do graphic editing like you would in Photoshop, GIMP is what is found in Linux. It does everything Photoshop does, but it's free and it's legal. If you need to write Word, Excel, PowerPoint documents, it's free on Linux under what's called LibreOffice, and it's legal. These are not programs written by Microsoft or Apple. They're written by the collective and open source project. At any rate, you must at times use a command line. That means that every once in a great while you have to type in a text-based command at a bleak, dark prompt. If you're not comfortable doing that, you're not going to like Linux. It's very rare, but you do have to do it sometimes. If you have to have certain types of Windows software, there are ways to run it on Linux, but it's not easy, and you have to tinker. It kind of reminds me of having an old hot rod. If you have an old 57 Chevy, you have to be able to open the hood a little bit and tinker a little bit to get everything to run perfectly. If you want to run Windows-based software on Linux, there are emulators and interfaces to do this, and there's things out there that will help you do it. Some of them are automatically installed. However, you do have to tinker from time to time. Apple devices do not play well with Linux. You can plug them in and they'll see it as an external hard drive. You might be able to download your music, but there's no good way to sync it. If you like to use iTunes to sync your Apple device with your computer or to back it up, it's not going to work well on Linux. There are ways to get iTunes to run on Linux. However, generally it doesn't sync over your USB ports when you do that. So if you have an Apple device, as I do, you can't really expect Linux to interface very well with it. The other thing that people have to contend with are that because it's open source, there are many, many different flavors, if you want to think of it that way, or distributions of Linux that are out there. And you have to know which one you really want. And once you have installed one, when you go to install software with it, you have to know which distribution you have. Now, these are a couple of little distractors, but I'll tell you, running Linux after you get used to it, it's so solid and it's fun. And the other thing is, it's not tied to any corporation. So you don't have big brothers like Apple or Microsoft watching you. Now, if you go onto their sites, or if you're using a Google web browser, or if you're using Google search, yeah, people are going to be watching you, and that still happens on Linux. But it is completely free from the corporate data mining that they do with their operating systems. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you a couple different distributions of Linux and what they look like. Most of this I'm going to do with VirtualBox. If you're not familiar with that, what that means is that I create a virtual computer in the memory of my desktop, and that way I can show you what these different distributions look like, and we'll run through the most popular ones. Ubuntu is probably the most popular one, and my understanding from this is that this originally came out of the UK, and it is actually what I am running underneath my Linux, and I'm doing this entire presentation in Linux right now. Linux Mint is also very popular. It is also another European distribution. It looks very much like Windows 10. So if you're comfortable with the Windows 10 setup but want to try Linux, Linux Mint looks and behaves a lot like Windows 10. PearOS. Believe it or not, somebody made a Linux distribution that looks like a Mac, or in other words, an Apple. Only the Linux version is called Pear. We'll run through that. Arch Linux. Arch Linux is an interesting distribution. The people who use Arch Linux consider themselves real Linux aficionados. You can install a graphical user interface with Arch Linux. However, out of the box, Arch is not easy to use. Making this video was the first time I had ever installed Arch Linux. It took me over an hour, and I've been using Linux for years. It also starts up at the command prompt. You have to know exactly what you want. You have to know exactly where you put it. I would not recommend this for beginners. It was kind of entertaining for me to do, and I'll show you what it looks like, but it's kind of cold and bleak until you would install a graphic user interface on it, which I have not done in this. I just wanted to show you what it really looks like out of the box. And finally, I'm going to show you my KDE. That's what I use on top. They do make a distribution that is called Neon. However, KDE is a shell on top of Linux that I use with my Ubuntu. So when you use KDE with it, it changes it to Ubuntu with a K in front of the Ubuntu. So that's what we're going to do a little bit of talking about today. And what I'd like to do is show you these distributions. I'm going to boot up my VirtualBox here, and we'll show you how they run. So the first thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to launch PearOS, and you're going to see it come up here in a little window, and think of each one of these windows as a separate computer. That's essentially what they are whenever you launch a virtual machine. I'm going to slide it over here a little bit so that you can see it, and we'll make it a little bit bigger so you can see the whole thing. And to anyone who has run a Mac, I'm going to click inside there so my mouse can be captured. Anyone who has run a Mac, this should be a very familiar looking interface. If we click on what looks like the Finder icon, it comes up and it shows you the different directories on your computer, and it should be a very familiar feel. The buttons are on the left, much like they are on a Mac, and this comes with Firefox and Thunderbird for your mail. Music is their different music machine, much like iTunes would be, and the Launchpad button here shows you the different applications that are installed in here where you could go and launch whatever you wanted to see from in there. And this, I have not done anything to this. This is just what comes pre-installed on PearOS. So what we're going to do, let me just get out of here real quick. And that's about all that you can say about this. This is very lightweight. This would run on an older computer marvelously. It is just very, very lightweight. And I could even go in here and change the background if I want to. This is the only one I have here. But say I would download something for the web, I could make it look very pretty. It's very fast and very lightweight. It does not come with an Office suite, which was something that I was a little bit surprised at. Most Linux distributions do come with a version already installed. So you shut this down just like you would shut down a computer. And we're going to move on to, I'm going to do Ubuntu next, since it is the most popular of all the Linux distributions. Linux Mint's very popular as well. So we're going to start this up, and this is the logo for Ubuntu. that they've been using for a long time. The current distribution is 21.10, and that is just out this year. And they've always gone with this kind of brown purple theme, and they name their versions after different animals. And they use a shell that is called GNOME, a graphic interface that is GNOME, and then their variant of this is called Unity. And you can see their icons go on the side, although you can go into the settings and you can change this so that it's anywhere and make it look however you want it to look. And instead of a launch pad, you'll see when I come up here, they actually have quite a few more applications installed, including LibreOffice, which if we want to go into LibreOffice, you'll see that it'll launch here within the window, and it's going to open up a spreadsheet that should look very much like Excel. And this will read and write Excel spreadsheets. My one son used LibreOffice all the way through college, sending his papers to the professors in a Microsoft format, but this is completely free. And you'll see that it looks just like it. It uses all the same commands. And they have a version of Word. They have a version of PowerPoint. They have all they have a database that comes along with it. And you can see that you can actually page between the various tabs here to show all the different applications that are available under Ubuntu. And this one I'm going to power out, just like I did the other one. Yes, I want to turn that computer off, and it'll go through a shutdown sequence. And let's move on to Linux Mint, which is also another very, very popular distribution. And this is the one that looks most like Windows 10 when you first boot it up. It opens up to a screen that has a button in the lower left-hand corner with, it'll come up to, let's ask me about my video drivers. It'll come up and it always has an information screen unless you choose to turn it off. But notice the buttons down here. This looks very much like Windows. You have a computer icon, a home icon on the screen, and if you push the Linux Mint button, you get a menu that looks incredibly like Windows that you would be used to using. You can also go in here, and this is an example of the software store. We talked about how they have an app store very similar to your cell phone. The first time that you launch it, it does take a moment to find all of the software that's available to your computer. And you can see, you can even run Steam games on here. Wine is actually a Windows emulator. But you can go through here and you can add all sorts of different software, and it's all free. And if you use this, it'll all install automatically. You don't have to do anything. So Linux Mint is very, very easy to use. And we talked about updating and ease of updating. You can see here, since this was an initial install, to catch up to the current date, this little orange dot means that there are updates available, and you can see that it's trying to tell me there's 118 things I could download. That would take too much time for this video, but it does show that it's very easy to update your computer. You would have to type in your password for the user, and you'd be off to the races. So we're going to shut that one down. And that's a very familiar interface. Now, I did include this, last but not least, is Arch. And Arch is very different looking. Even when you see booting up here, it comes into kind of a bleak command prompt environment. It requires you to log in with your username and your password. It's going to give me grief here. So this is what Arch, now like I told you, you can add a graphic user face to it, but this is what Arch looks like out of the box. It is just a blinking command prompt. The very first thing that you can really see out of the box is I have one program installed here that is this NeoFetch that is very popular on Arch, just to show what your computer statistics are and exactly what you are running, what the processor is on your computer, and that this is a virtual machine that I am running here. It took me an hour to install this, and basically this is all I have. I would not recommend this for a beginning Linux user. It is funny in the Linux community, though. There's always these jokes and memes about anyone who uses Arch Linux insists on telling you that they use Arch Linux because it means they're a power user. Even to shut off this computer, I have to give a sudo, which is a super user command, to shut down now. And I have to enter a password again to do that. It is not a friendly environment. Oh, and I mistyped it again. There we go. And that was the end of the distribution. Finally, I actually use KDE. And KDE is just a layer that goes over top of Ubuntu to make it look different. And I'm actually running a shell that looks like Windows 11. And you may ask, well, if you're running Linux, why do you want it to look like Windows 11? It's a valid question. But this shell was actually made as a point of humor when Windows 11 announced its new format and that it would be released in like 6 months. Within 2 days, everything that happened on Windows 11, the Linux community had already formulated to show that they could have a release. And you can see that they even have the box similar here to Windows 11, and that if I want to pull up a file folder and if I move anything, you can see that I have the see-through blur that they have. But KDE is just another shell. The two most popular shells out there are GNOME, which is very common and is usually what is installed, and KDE is an alternative that I happen to like, and it has a lot of features. Now I could change this to look any way that I want to. I had initially done this just for the sake of humor at the time, and I thought that it was kind of comical. But KDE also comes with, if you type in here LibreOffice, it comes with a full LibreOffice suite. If I want to boot up something that looks like Word and I can read, write, Excel. I also have things here. We talked briefly about GIMP. GIMP is an image manipulation program that looks like Photoshop, and it can do everything that Photoshop does. I'm currently running OBS Studio to make this recording in another monitor. And as you can see, I have several browsers and Thunderbird installed. I also have DaVinci Resolve for post-production. So there are a ton of different things that you can do with this, and you can even see here that you can load any type of browser that you want to load, and it will bring it right up on the screen. I have Discord. I even have games that I run. Steam is easy to run as well, and many of the games will work. Steam has a built-in compatibility layer for Windows games. So that's about it. That's what Linux is all about. It's an operating system with many distributions, increased security, and less viruses, less crashes, and it's completely open source and is not tied to any big corporate data mining process. So that's why I like it. So if you found this video useful, please subscribe below. Give us a like. If you have any comments, whether they be criticisms or compliments, please leave them below. Try not to be too nasty, and we'll talk to you later. Thanks.